So, in this relatively short lecture video, what I want to talk about is perhaps one of the more interesting aspects of resource economics and not really talked about very often, which is odd, I think you'll find as we dig into the topic, because it's incredibly important. And it's certainly a topic that is or should be a part of the broader conversation we have about the use of natural resources, whatever those natural resources are. Now, ultimately, we're going to focus mainly on oil, and you can sort of extend this conversation to the other fossil fuels, so not just oil but natural gas and coal. And what we're going to do is we're going to talk about something called the resource curse. The resource curse sounds bad, and it is bad, but the basic idea behind the resource curse is that there is this propensity for cities, countries, states, whatever the geographic designation is, if those regions are resource rich, they have a particular resource, which inevitably means it's underground or it's in a mountain, or maybe they're next to an ocean and there's a well-populated fishery or whatever, forests, water, so on and so forth, that if those resources are economically important, that uh, those regions will tie themselves to those resources. They sort of tie their fate, in other words, to those particular resources. And of course, this has tremendous economic as well as environmental consequences, and it happens all the time. And when I say it, I mean suffering from the resource curse. And we're certainly going to talk about three particular examples in this lecture. We're going to talk about North Dakota in the United States. We're going to talk about the countries of Russia and Nigeria. All three of these entities, while the actual experience they have is, of course, distinct, there are many similarities between their experiences. And those experiences are derived principally by what is economically the most important thing in those countries. And what is economically important in those countries is the extraction of oil, the extraction of crude oil in particular. And the issue is not that it isn't necessarily a good thing to have natural resources as an important component of your economy. That can be very useful. The development of natural resource extraction is both an economically meaningful industry, as well as the natural innovations and making those processes safer and cleaner. Those things tend to go hand in hand as well. However, if the country or the region invests too much of their economic portfolio, so to speak, in those particular resources, then much the same way that like market power warps markets in ways which are not beneficial to consumers as well as the market writ large, then we may start to label those instances market failures. In other words, these are instances in which allowing the market to sort of dictate the outcomes of a particular scenario lead to adverse outcomes. And we've talked, of course, about market failures throughout the course, and really they are the core of a course like this. The best way I could kind of frame it is the idea, and I've already sort of mentioned this, is the idea behind an asset portfolio that is not diversified. The number one investment advice anyone can ever give you is to make sure that your portfolio is diverse. That is to say that you have purchased assets in a varied enough industry mix that you are not tying your investment outcomes to any one particular industry, or even worse, to any one particular country. This is, of course, why there are the world of ETFs, equity trading funds, where the idea is that I buy ETFs, and ETFs are put together by investment brokerages to be diverse investments. So instead of buying individual company stocks, I can instead purchase ETFs. The ETFs are diversified. There are different types of ETFs. Part of the rating of ETFs is based upon their level of diversification. There are ETFs which are focused on, companies which, support social causes. There are ETFs, mainly with respect to commodities, so on and so forth, right? So ETFs are this investment vehicle that were created. They were a response to the fact that people want diversification in their asset portfolios. And this is very true of economic systems as well, although we don't really talk about this a whole lot. If you look at the New York City economy, I think people often think that it is important or it is successful because it was here first. That New York City just happened to be one of the earlier places that people stopped and settled, and therefore just naturally that's why all the economics tends to happen, or a lot of the economics tends to happen in New York City. But the truth is that the actual health of New York City arises primarily from the diversification of that city's economic portfolio, right? Our city's uh, economic portfolio, meaning that there's just a lot of things to do here. There are a lot of different careers, there are a lot of different industries, there are a lot of different types of, of careers within a lot of different types of industries. And as a result, this sort of lubricates the economic system and keeps it going, even if one or two or three industries see some sort of economic downturn, right? So you're not relying upon any one particular industry, but you have a lot of different industries. And over time, what this means is that whenever there's some relative economic disruption, places like New York City are diverse enough that there's still a lot of successful economic activity going on in the city, despite the fact that there may be problems in particular industries. So again, it's the same principle of diversifying your portfolio. Juxtapose New York City with a place like Detroit, Michigan, where in the 30s, 40s, and 50s, they rapidly put all of their eggs into a single basket, that basket being the automotive industry. And then when the automotive industry began shipping their jobs overseas in search of cheap labor, that those areas in and around Detroit, Michigan began to shed populations because jobs were simply not available there anymore. And those that got left behind were left behind in severely economically depressed regions. And then, of course, this has spillovers into the political structure, and it really starts to rear its ugly head in ways that started out as economic, but then become worse in other areas as well. And we see this play out in a lot of different countries. So you can think about a lack of diversification for your portfolio as risk. You're taking on risk, just like you would in the context of stocks and bonds. If a city or a country puts all of their economic eggs into one basket, they are bringing on risk. And that risk is economic, it's political, and cultural. And when I say cultural risk, what I mean is that you stand to lose the cultural significance of a particular area, because once you destroy that area's economics and politics, fewer people want to live there, and that will naturally disrupt those extremely important cultural underpinnings that can often, be um, not just economically meaningful, but also socially meaningful as well. And that's certainly true of a place like Detroit. Like prior to Detroit's collapse, it was this incredibly culturally important place in America. For any number of reasons. And then after its collapse, it's lost a lot of that cultural underpinning. And much like, New York losing its art scene, or at least diminishing its art scene over time by the city becoming very expensive to live in, you start to lose a little bit of that diversification. So New York City, despite being, generally speaking, a very good economic system, has suffered from the fact that it's losing a bit of its identity over time, and it's maybe less of a place that artists are going to because it's cheap. You know, you can find cheap places to live, and there's a thriving art scene, and so on and so forth. And of course, ironically enough, to bring this back, we see increasingly that artists and musicians have moved to places like Detroit, Michigan, because now it's cheap to live in Detroit, Michigan. Unfortunately, however, there's a real cultural shift that has occurred as well. You have the issues of gentrification, and we see that in both places as well, both in New York City as well as Michigan. So moving on, we see the resource curse show up in a lot of different places. We're going to focus on the economics, but we'll kind of, you know, belabor this with again those political and cultural issues as well. Because the truth is that a lack of economic diversity tends to then create a lot of incentives for bad actors to come in and create sort of exploitative situations, be they politically or be they economic. And of course, this is not something that we necessarily want anyone to experience. So let's talk about three, obviously unique geographic areas. The first one we'll talk about is North Dakota. So North Dakota in the United States. And so let's look at North Dakota's GDP over time. You'll notice that, interestingly enough, that the gross domestic product of North Dakota was fairly unaffected by the Great Recession, right? Now, this is probably really surprising to you because you think, well, didn't the Great Recession affect anyone? Well, the truth is that no, the recession did not have much of an effect on North Dakota whatsoever. However, you will notice that there is this economic downturn that occurs in 2014, begins in 2014, and extends until around 2017, and then we see that increase. This would be very shocking, I think, to a lot of people to actually look at this data and to see that somehow um, North Dakota was unaffected, somewhat by the Great Recession, and yet, what happened in 2014? What's going on in 2014 that leads to these economic problems? Well, what happened in that is something we'll get to a little bit later. But let's talk about first this really quick uptick in GDP, right? So this really quick uptick in GDP arises because there is rapid development of oil extraction going on in North Dakota that really kicks off kind of at the tail end of the Bush administration. And then, as you can see, really ramps up during the Obama administration. So one of the things that people, again, you don't hear people mention very often is that under the Obama administration, the United States really ramped up its level of domestic oil extraction. So prior to the Obama administration, the United States was essentially a net oil importer. That is, that we imported more oil than we exported. And then early on into the Trump administration, buoyed by a lot of what happened during the Obama administration, the US is now a net oil exporter, meaning that we actually export more oil than we import. This is a sea change in the relationship between the United States and oil. And increasingly, we are, for a number of reasons, extracting our own oil, refining our own oil, and in fact, increasingly, like I mentioned, exporting that oil to other places. You can see that this dramatic increase in oil extraction is one of the reasons in which North Dakota was able to avoid any significant economic contraction from the Great Recession. So the fact that North Dakota had put their eggs into the oil basket in the early part of the 2000s and on through the late Bush administration, second Bush administration, and the Obama administration is one of the reasons why they avoid the Great Recession in some respects. However, of course, that did not come without its costs as well. Here's an article written in 2016 that talks about how the oil boom in North Dakota also coincided with a tremendous increase in crime. So what you have at this situation is you have a lot of people moving to North Dakota, a lot of rapid population increase. You have a lot of transient individuals who are not from North Dakota. They're moving up there for jobs. jobs, and have very little ties to those particular areas. And when that occurs, you have a lot of money now flowing into that particular area. It is sort of a situation rife, with crime and ripe for crime as well. And so the oil boom did not come without its costs. And of course, this wasn't the only cost that is associated with the oil boom. If you're an environmentalist, you look at oil booms and you sort of hang your head a bit, because you know that every time we extract oil, that's another fossil fuel that we're going to burn, and we're going to emit, CO2, particulate matter, all the things associated with burning those fossil fuels, regardless of your acknowledgement that we need the oil in the context of the economic system, which still relies heavily on combustion engine vehicles, which are the primary demand that is for oil, but also airplanes and container ships and all these different forms of transportation that use oil and the refinement of oil into fuel as the primary energy source. And so uh, oil extraction is good for the US economy to a certain extent, but beyond the economic growth potential, there are these, negative spillovers. There's the environmental spillover, there's the social spillover we see here with crime. And so it's not all this rosy story, right? But of course, if you are someone who has a vested interest in this rosy story, then you're going to write things like this. So this is basically a PR statement. Economic output in North Dakota from oil and gas remains strong despite down year. This was, I believe, what year this was written in. I'm not exactly sure what year it is. But what's interesting about this press release is that at a certain point, um, they mention that the industry is the most economically important industry for the state of North Dakota. Right, it says it right out. And by the way, this is again North Dakota Petroleum Council. Right, these are these are people who represent oil extractors. Right, so they want to talk about how great oil and gas is. Obviously, they're not talking about the upturn in crime that occurred. They're not talking about the environmental damage that's going on. They're talking about how great all this economic output is for the state of North Dakota. Of course, as we already saw in the graph, if you fast forward to the later stages of 2014, 2015, 2016, you'll of course see GDP decline. Literally, the economy of North Dakota contracted. There were massive job losses. You had bankruptcies, went way up. During this time period, crime continued to increase because obviously there was crime, and then every time you have an economic downturn, you tend to get a little bit more crime as well. And so, yeah, the oil and gas have done a great job of being a boon to the economic system, but you can see that, of course, this declines. And again, so the question is why? What is going on in this time period that would cause the North Dakota economy to decline, despite the fact that the Great Recession, in part because of their investment in oil, did not see it to decline, right? So again, that's the question that we will certainly get to. So this is the resource curse right here. We see the resource curse, right? So the boon to your economy, put all of your eggs into one basket, and then you see this decline, okay? Now let's look at Nigeria, right? So let's look at Nigerian GDP, all right? And I want you to focus on this area right here. I want you to look at that date. Let me make myself a little smaller here. All right. So if we look at this date here, we'll notice again, it's after the Great Recession. Nigeria, as we can see, had a little bit of a dip during the Great Recession, but rebounded pretty quickly. And we see, but a similar thing that we saw before around 2014, 2015, you see this dip in GDP. All right. Let's also consider the fact that in Nigeria, perhaps the most important economic industry is oil and gas. And not only is it the most important economic industry, but it's incredibly powerful within the country. It has sort of sinked its teeth into the politics of Nigeria, as the oil and gas industry does everywhere it is relatively important. And like North Dakota, it's left a little bit of a trail of environmental destruction. So this is a picture of an oil well that caught fire in Nigeria in 2006. This is a leaking well. The Nigerian oil development, primarily from Shell, the Shell Corporation, Shell Oil, has done an untold amount of environmental damage in the country of Nigeria. Primarily in and around the region near the Nigerian Delta, which makes it sort of especially egregious. And then again, on top of this environmental destruction, we see this again, these declines in economics and GDP. And again, this is because, partly at least, but mainly, um, that Nigeria has made oil and natural gas the most important component of their economy. Okay. All right. Now let's move on to Russia. All right. Let's look at Russia GDP per capita. Huh. Interesting. All of these places, North Dakota, Nigeria, and Russia. Russia, by the way, single most important economic industry in Russia, oil and gas, absolutely. We see all of their economies decline around 2013, 2014. So, what is this? Why are all of these oil and gas rich countries seeing their prospects decline in and around 2012, 2014, after rapid periods of economic improvement prior to that point, right? You see that, of course, the Great Recession affected Russia pretty hard, but very rapid development here economically. If we go back and we look at Nigeria, again, a little blip from the Great Recession, rapid economic development here, and then a steep decline. And then if we go back and we look at North Dakota, rapid development, and then pretty sizable decline here. Okay, so here's what's going on. What's going on in around 2013, 2014